Warhorse Chapter 12. In places now, the guns were lined up only a few yards apart for miles and miles, and when they sounded out, the free and the very earth shook beneath us. The lines of wounded seemed interminable now, and the countryside was laid waste for miles behind the trenches. The work itself was certainly no harder than when we had been pulling the ambulance cart, but now we were no longer stable every night, and of course we no longer had the protection of our Emily to rely on. Food was scarce now. We received our corn ration only spasmodically as winter came on again, and there was only a marriage hay ration for each of us. One by one, we began to lose weight and condition. At the same time, the battle seemed to become more furious and prolonged, and we worked longer and harder hours, pulling in front of the gun. We were permanently sore and permanently cold. We ended every day covered in a layer of cold, deepened mud that seemed to seep through and chill us to the bones. Strangely enough, it was the giant Henny who showed the first signs of weakness. The cold sinking mud and the lack of proper fodder through that appalling winter began to shrink his massive frame and reduce him within months to a poor skinny-looking creature. So to my delight, and I must confess it, they moved me up into the leading pair with Todthorne, and Henny dropped back now to pull alongside little Coco, who had begun the ordeal with little strength in reserve. They both went rapidly downhill until the two of them were only any use for pulling on flat, hard surfaces, and since we scarcely ever traveled over such ground, they were soon little use in the team and made the work for the rest of us that much more arduous. Each night we spent in the lines up to our hocks in freezing mud, in conditions far worse than the first winter of the war when Todthorne and I had been cavalry horses. Then each horse had had a trooper who did all he could to care for us and comfort us. But now the efficiency of the gun was the first priority, and we came a very poor second. We were mere work horses, and treated as such. The gunners themselves were grey in the face with exhaustion and hunger. Survival was all that mattered to them now. The effects of continual exposure, underfeeding, and hard work were now apparent in all of us. Few of us had any hair growing on our lower legs, and the skin below was a mass of cracked sores. Even the rugged little halflingers began to lose condition. Like all the others, I found every step I took now excruciatingly painful, particularly in my forelegs, which were cracking badly from the knees downwards. And there was not a horse in the team that was not walking lame. The vets treated us the best they could, and even the most hard-hearted of the gunners seemed disturbed as our condition worsened. But there was nothing anyone could do until the mud disappeared. The field vets shook their heads in despair, and pulled back those they could for rest and recuperation, but some had deteriorated so much that they were led away and shot there and then after the vet's inspection. Henny went that way one morning, and we passed him lying in the mud, a collapsed wreck of a horse, and so eventually did Coco, who was hit in his neck by a flying shrapnel and had to be destroyed where he lay by the side of the road. No matter how much I disliked him, and he was a vicious beast, it was piteous and terrible sight to see a fellow creature with whom I had pulled for so long discredited and forgotten in a ditch. I first noticed that Todthorne was failing when I felt the gun pulling more heavily than before. We were fording a small stream when the wheels of the gun became stuck in the mud. I turned quickly to look at him and saw him suddenly laboring and low in his stride. His eyes told me the pain he was suffering, and I pulled all the harder to enable him to ease up. And sure enough, he was up on his feet the next morning before the gunners came to feed us our ration of corn, and although his head hung lower than usual and he moved only ponderously, I could see that he had the strength to survive if only he could rest. I noticed, however, that when the vet came that day checking along the lines, he looked long and hard at Todthorne and listened carefully to his jets. "He's a strong one," I heard him tell the spectacled officer. "He's fit to go on," said the vet reluctantly, "but I am warning you, Herr Major, you must take care." We do what we can," said the Major dismissively, and to be fair they did. It was the mud that was killing us one by one, the mud, the lack of shelter, and the lack of food. Warhorse Chapter 13. So Todthorne came into that spring weakened, severely by his illness and still with a husky cough. But he had survived. We had both survived. There was hard ground to go on now, and the grass grew once more in the fields, so that our bodies began to fill out again, and our coats lost their winter redness and shone in the sun. The sun shone too on the soldiers whose uniforms of gray and red stayed cleaner. The rations improved too with the weather, and our gun team stepped out with a new enthusiasm and purpose. The sores disappeared from our legs, and we had full bellies each day. All the grass we could eat and oats in plenty. The two little halflingers puffed and snorted behind us, and they shamed Todthorn and me into a gallop, something we had not been able to achieve all winter no matter how hard our riders tried to whip us on. But there were no battles for us that summer. There was always sporadic firing and shelling, but the army seemed content to growl at each other and threaten without even coming to grips. Idleness, even boredom, set in as we gazed the lush buttercup meadows, and we even became fat for the first time since we came to war. Purpose it was because we became too fat that Todthorn and I were chosen to pull the ammunition cart from the railhead some miles away up to the artillery lines. And so we found ourselves under the command of the kind old soldier who had been so good to us all winter. Mad old Friedrich was the old soldier they set to work on tasks no one else wanted to do because he was always obliging and everyone knew it. The cart was always too heavy for us to pull because they insisted at the railhead on filling it up with as many shells as possible in spite of Frederick's protestations. They simply laughed at him, ignored him, and piled on the shells. On the way back to the artillery lines, Frederick would always walk up the hills, leading us slowly, for he knew how heavy the wagon must have been. We stopped often for rest and for water, and he made quite sure that we had more food than the other horses who were resting all that summer. We soon discovered that Frederick was not in the slightest bit mad, but simply a kind and gentle man whose whole nature cried out against fighting a war. "I tell you, my friends," he said one day, "I tell you that I am the only sane man in the regiment. It's the others that are mad, but they don't know it. They fight a war and they don't know what for. Isn't that crazy? How can one man kill another and not really know the reason why he does it, except that the other man wears a different color uniform and speaks a different language? And it's me they call mad. You two are the only rational creatures I've met in this benighted war, and like me, the only reason you're here is because you were brought here. If I had the courage, and I haven't, we'd take off down this road and never come back." The summer passed slowly into autumn, and it became clear that our time with Frederick was coming to an end. Such was Frederick's attachment to Todthorn by now that he volunteered to ride him out on the gun team exercises that we were to proceed to the autumn campaign. And so we found ourselves the leading pair once again, with mad old Frederick riding up on Todthorn. We had found at last a true friend and one we could trust implicitly. "If I have to die out here away from my home," Frederick confided in Todthorn one day, "I would rather die alongside you. But I will do my best to see to it that we all get through and get back home. That much I promise you."